At the far southern edge of the world, the land does not rise in a clear line. It dissolves into ice. The shoreline fractures into shelves and flows, shifting slowly with currents that are not visible from the surface. Sound carries differently here. Wind moves across open water and frozen mass without obstruction, flattening distance. There are no permanent markers, no fixed boundaries. For much of the year, the region remains locked in cold stability. Temperatures stay below freezing. Light comes in long, low arcs, never fully warming the surface. In winter months, darkness settles for extended periods. In summer, the sun lingers, but offers little heat. The ice expands and contracts, but never rests. It is a place where movement is gradual, but constant. Sheets of ice press against one another. Pressure builds without warning, then releases in long fractures. Leads of open water appear and close again. What seems solid can shift within hours. There are no settlements, no routine passage of ships. Early 20th century expeditions entered these waters with limited maps and incomplete understanding of seasonal patterns. The margin between land and sea remained uncertain. From a distance, the landscape appears still, but that stillness conceals motion beneath the surface. In 1915, one such expedition moved into this environment, intending to cross a continent that had not yet been traversed on foot. The conditions they entered would not remain passive. The expedition was organized under the leadership of Ernest Shackleton. By 1914, he had already taken part in earlier Antarctic journeys and had come within reach of the South Pole during the Nimrod expedition. His next objective was more extensive. It was planned as the first land crossing of Antarctica, from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea, passing through the South Pole. To carry out this plan, two separate groups were organized. Shackleton would lead the main party aboard the ship Endurance into the Weddell Sea. From there, his team would land and begin the transcontinental journey. A second group, approaching from the opposite side, would lay supply depots across the Ross ice shelf to support the crossing party later. The men selected for the Endurance expedition came from varied backgrounds. Some were experienced sailors, others were scientists, including meteorologists and biologists. There were also individuals chosen for their physical endurance and practical skills. The group included figures such as Frank Worsley, who served as captain and navigator, and Thomas Crean, known for his previous polar experience. Frank Wild acted as Shackleton's second-in-command, responsible for maintaining order and discipline among the crew. In total, 28 men boarded the Endurance. They departed in August 1914, as the World War I had just begun in Europe. Shackleton had offered to delay the expedition in light of the war, but was instructed to proceed. The journey moved southward through the Atlantic, stopping at South Georgia Island, which served as the final staging point before entering Antarctic waters. At South Georgia, experienced whalers warned of heavy ice conditions in the Weddell Sea that season. Reports indicated that pack ice was denser than usual, extending farther north than expected. These warnings were noted, but the expedition continued. The window for entering the Weddell Sea was limited, and delay could have meant losing an entire year. The Endurance left South Georgia in December 1914. The ship was built for polar conditions, reinforced to withstand pressure from surrounding ice. Its design reflected earlier Arctic vessels, with a rounded hull intended to rise above ice rather than be crushed by it. As the ship moved south, the ice began to thicken. Leads of open water narrowed. Progress slowed. The crew worked constantly to navigate through shifting channels, adjusting course as the pack closed around them. The plan remained unchanged. The objective was still the continental crossing, but the environment was beginning to define its own terms. By January 1915, the Endurance had entered deep into the Weddell Sea. Progress had become intermittent. Open channels appeared briefly, then closed again under shifting pressure. The crew advanced when possible, stopping when movement was blocked. On January 18, the ship became fully enclosed by pack ice. There was no clear lead ahead. The surrounding ice tightened gradually, holding the vessel in place. At first, this was not considered unusual. Expeditions in polar regions often experienced temporary entrapment, followed by release when conditions shifted. The crew reduced engine use and waited for natural movement in the ice to open a path forward. Days passed without change. The ice did not break apart. Instead, it thickened. Pressure from surrounding floes increased as wind and current pushed them together. The Endurance began to drift with the pack, carried slowly westward. The intended landing point on the Antarctic coast was no longer reachable. By February, it was clear that the ship would not break free in the current season. Shackleton altered the plan. The expedition would wait through the winter while the ice carried them, then attempt to resume movement when conditions improved. Rations were reorganized. Fuel consumption was reduced. The crew settled into a period of enforced stillness. As winter approached, temperatures dropped further. Darkness extended across longer hours of the day. The ice around the ship became thicker and more rigid. Pressure built gradually, without a single defining moment. In October 1915, the force reached a critical point. The surrounding ice pressed inward with sustained intensity. The hull of the Endurance began to bend under pressure. Wooden beams shifted. The structure held for a time, then started to fail. Water entered the ship. Pumps were used continuously, but the inflow could not be contained. The crew began removing supplies, sledges, and lifeboats onto the ice. Equipment was stacked nearby in organized groups, anticipating a full evacuation. On the 21st of November 1915, the Endurance finally sank beneath the ice. The ship that had carried the expedition into the Weddell Sea was no longer part of their survival. The men remained, standing on the surface that had taken it. After the loss of the Endurance, the expedition shifted entirely to the ice. The surface beneath them was not fixed land, but a moving platform of compressed floes. It drifted slowly with currents and wind, carrying the group farther from their intended route. Ernest Shackleton reorganized the men immediately. Survival now depended on structure. Supplies were limited and had to be controlled with precision. The lifeboats, originally intended for short emergency use, became central to any long-term plan. They were secured on the ice alongside crates of food, fuel, and essential equipment. The first objective was stability. A camp was established near the site where the ship had been lost. Tents were erected using salvaged materials. Snow blocks were arranged to provide partial wind protection. The men were assigned regular duties, maintaining camp, managing rations, caring for dogs, and monitoring the condition of the ice. Food supplies included preserved meat, biscuits, and concentrated rations brought from the ship. Over time, these were supplemented by hunting. Seals and penguins were present in the region, and their meat became a necessary addition. Nothing was wasted. Blubber was used as fuel when other sources ran low. Routine was enforced deliberately. Meals were scheduled. Tasks were distributed evenly. Even small acts such as preparing food or maintaining equipment were treated as essential structure. Without routine, time would lose definition. The ice itself required constant observation. Cracks formed without warning. Pressure ridges rose as flows collided and overlapped. Leads of open water could appear between sections of ice, then close again within hours. The camp had to remain mobile. Equipment was packed in a way that allowed for rapid relocation if necessary. Temperatures remained consistently below freezing. Exposure was continuous. Clothing had to be dried and repaired regularly to prevent deterioration. Frost accumulation inside tents was a persistent problem, forming from condensed breath and freezing against fabric surfaces. The dogs, originally intended for sled travel across the continent, were now part of camp life. They required food and management, adding to the daily workload. Over time, their role would change as resources became more limited. Communication within the group remained controlled. Frank Wild supported Shackleton in maintaining order. Decisions were made centrally, with minimal uncertainty allowed to spread among the men. The expedition no longer moved toward its original objective. Instead, it adapted to the conditions imposed by the drifting ice. Direction was no longer chosen. It was determined by forces beyond their control. The men adjusted to this shift. Their survival depended on accepting it. The camp remained on the drifting ice through the Antarctic winter of 1916. There was no fixed position. The flow carried the men slowly northward, away from the Antarctic continent, and into the wider expanse of the Weddell Sea. Movement was constant, though rarely visible in the moment. Navigation depended on observation over time, using limited instruments salvaged from the Endurance before it sank. Days became difficult to distinguish from one another. The sun remained low or absent, and the horizon offered little variation. Snow accumulated and shifted with the wind. The surface of the ice changed gradually. Then suddenly, as pressure from surrounding floes altered its structure, the men continued their routines. Food was rationed carefully. Seal and penguin hunting remained necessary, but availability was inconsistent. Some days provided adequate supply, others did not. Fuel was limited. Blubber fires supplemented cooking and warmth when possible, though they produced smoke and residue that accumulated inside the tents. The condition of the ice became more unstable as temperatures began to rise slightly toward the end of winter. Cracks formed more frequently. Leads of open water appeared with increasing regularity. The camp had to be moved multiple times as sections of ice broke apart or shifted position. Equipment was dragged across uneven surfaces, often over ridges formed by compressed flows. At one stage, Shackleton ordered an attempt to march across the ice toward open water, pulling the lifeboats on sledges. The objective was to reach a point where the boats could be launched and used for escape. Progress proved extremely slow. The surface was fragmented and uneven, making movement difficult. After several days, the attempt was abandoned. The energy required exceeded the distance gained. The group returned to a stationary approach, waiting for the ice to carry them further north, where conditions might allow navigation by sea. This decision required patience. It also meant continuing exposure to an environment that was becoming less stable over time. Morale was managed through structure rather than encouragement. Tasks remained consistent. Roles did not change. The absence of clear progress was not emphasized. As spring approached, the ice began to break more rapidly. Larger sections separated into smaller flows. Open water widened between them. The surface that had supported the camp for months was no longer continuous. The possibility of remaining on the ice was diminishing. The lifeboats, once stored as precaution, were becoming necessary. The group prepared to leave the ice behind. By April 1916, the ice had fragmented to a point where remaining on it was no longer viable. The floe that supported the camp had reduced in size, breaking at its edges and shifting unpredictably. Open water surrounded the remaining sections. The men prepared to launch the lifeboats that had been preserved since the loss of the Endurance. 3 boats were available: the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. Each had been reinforced using materials salvaged earlier. Their capacity was limited, and the sea conditions they would face were uncertain. On April 9, the group began boarding. Supplies were distributed carefully, with priority given to navigation tools, food, and minimal equipment for shelter. The dogs, which had been part of the expedition since departure, were no longer retained. Resources could not support them during the journey by sea. The boats entered open water under unstable conditions. Ice floes moved continuously, forcing constant adjustment in direction. The men rowed in coordinated shifts, navigating through narrow channels while avoiding collisions with larger ice masses. Progress was slow and physically demanding. Exposure increased immediately. Water entered the boats in small amounts, requiring constant removal. Cold conditions persisted, though temperatures were slightly higher than during the winter months. Wet clothing added to the strain, reducing insulation and increasing fatigue. Navigation depended largely on the skill of Frank Worsley, who used brief sightings of the sun when visibility allowed. Cloud cover often prevented accurate readings. The direction of travel was maintained through estimation when direct observation was not possible. The objective was to reach land. The nearest known point was Elephant Island, located at the edge of the Antarctic Peninsula. It was uninhabited and rarely visited, but it offered solid ground. The journey lasted several days. Conditions remained inconsistent. At times, the sea opened enough to allow steady movement. At other moments, dense ice forced delays or redirection. On the 15th of April, 1916, the boats reached the shoreline of Elephant Island. The landing was made on a narrow, exposed strip of land. For the first time in over a year, the men stood on solid ground that was not moving beneath them. The island offered limited shelter. Its terrain was rocky and partially covered in ice. There were no natural resources beyond what could be gathered from the surrounding sea. The journey across the ice had ended. A new phase of survival began on land that was no less isolated. Elephant Island provided temporary stability, but it did not offer a path to rescue. The island lay outside regular shipping routes. No permanent settlements existed there. Remaining indefinitely would not lead to recovery. Ernest Shackleton assessed the situation and determined that a smaller group would need to leave the island to seek assistance. The majority would remain behind under the supervision of Frank Wild. The selected destination was South Georgia, a whaling station located approximately 1,300 kilometers away across open ocean. The vessel chosen for the journey was the James Caird, the strongest of the three lifeboats. It was modified further using available materials. Additional decking was added to provide limited protection from waves. Gaps were sealed as effectively as possible. Supplies were reduced to essentials to keep the boat as light as conditions allowed. On the 24th of April, 1916, 6 men departed: Elephant Island, Shackleton, Frank Worsley, Tom Crean, and 3 others. The remaining 22 men stayed on the island, relying on the expectation that the boat would reach South Georgia and organize rescue. The journey required navigation across one of the most challenging ocean passages in the world. The Southern Ocean presented continuous swell, strong winds, and low temperatures. The boat was small relative to the conditions. Water entered regularly, and the crew worked continuously to remove it. Navigation again depended on Worsley's observations. Opportunities to take accurate readings were rare. The boat rose and fell with large waves, making stable measurement difficult. Cloud cover often obscured the sun. Position was estimated using limited data, requiring constant adjustment. Exposure remained severe. The men were frequently wet, and drying clothing was not possible. Ice accumulated on surfaces during colder periods. Movement inside the boat was restricted, and rest was minimal. Each man operated within a fixed role, maintaining function without interruption. After more than 2 weeks at sea, the boat reached the coast of South Georgia on the 10th of May, 1916. The landing point was on the uninhabited southern side of the island. The whaling stations were located on the northern coast, separated by mountainous terrain that had not been mapped in detail. The journey by sea had ended, but access to assistance was still not immediate. The final stage required crossing the island itself. The men remaining on Elephant Island continued to wait. On Elephant Island, the remaining 22 men established a more permanent shelter using the 2 boats that had not been taken. The hulls were turned upside down and supported with stone and ice, forming a low structure against the wind. Snow was packed along the sides to reduce exposure. Frank Wild maintained a consistent routine. Rations were strictly controlled. Food sources remained limited to seals and penguins when available. Fuel came from blubber, burned in confined spaces for warmth and cooking. Smoke accumulated inside the shelter, with little ventilation. Time was measured in days without external reference. Weather conditions shifted without pattern. Wind remained constant, often strong enough to disrupt movement outside the shelter. The shoreline provided limited access to the sea, depending on ice conditions. There was no communication with the outside world. No ships passed within visible range. The men depended entirely on the assumption that the boat party had reached South Georgia and would organize a return. Physical condition declined gradually. Clothing remained damp. Drying was difficult in the environment. Fatigue was persistent, though managed through assigned tasks and enforced routine. Wild continued to prepare the camp each day as if rescue might occur. Equipment was kept in order. A lookout was maintained when conditions allowed visibility. The structure of daily life remained unchanged. The outcome remained uncertain. On South Georgia, the boat party that had left Elephant Island completed a difficult overland crossing to reach the whaling station at Stromness. From there, arrangements were made for rescue of the remaining men. Ernest Shackleton organized the return as quickly as conditions allowed. Several attempts to reach Elephant Island were delayed by sea ice and weather. On the 30th of August 1916, A ship finally reached the island, and the remaining men were recovered. The group under Frank Wild had remained in place since April. All 22 men were found alive. There was no formal ceremony. The evacuation was carried out efficiently, with attention focused on safety and transport rather than recognition. The survival phase of the expedition ended without expansion of the original mission. The expedition did not cross Antarctica. The ship Endurance was lost, and the continent remained untraversed. All 28 men survived under Ernest Shackleton. The record of their journey became a documented case of endurance under extreme isolation and shifting ice conditions in the Weddell Sea region. The ice continued to move,